All right, today we're going to be taking some notes on scientific notation and powers of 10. So I gave you a real quick reminder up at the top of your screen here. Remember that oh, standard form is any regular old number here. So I gave you a hint and some examples of what I mean by that. Next, you'll see my graphic organizer, and you will see me using this. However, I do want to point out a couple of very important things. This box right here, this box can only hold one number. So you cannot put 15 in there because that has two numbers in it. You can only put the number 1 or the number 5. You can only fit one number in that box. All the rest of your numbers need to go on that blank after your decimal. One last piece that I really want to draw your attention to is this part right here. That power on that 10 tells you how many hops that you will be using. If you have a positive number here, you're going to move to the right. If you have a negative number in that exponent, you are going to move to the left. All right, so let's see that as we kind of use it here. So scientific notation to standard form, so changing it into that regular number. We've got a couple of steps here I want you to write down as I move. So it says first I need to write down that number. When I say that, I mean that first number that's getting multiplied. So here I have 5.7 as that first number. Now the next step that you're going to see, step number 2, says to move the decimal using the exponent. So that exponent is going to tell me if I need to move right or left and how many hops. So in this case, remember, positive is going to move to the right and negative is moving to the left. This is a positive 8 here. So I'm going to hop 8 spaces to the right. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, once I've done all those hops, I've got some spaces that I've got to put zeros in. So make sure that you put in all the zeros, and this is where it helps to be very, very neat, because that's going to come in handy here. Now I need to rewrite my final answer without those hops. I need to see your final answer without your work there. Your hops are your work. Now we got to put our final answer. So I'm still going to have that 5 and that 7. Whoop. So I'm still going to have, I don't know why my marker's not working, my 5 and my 7. And then I'm going to put all those zeros. You can't put just 8 zeros because your exponent is 8. You've got to count how many you actually needed in those hops. So I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, only 7 zeros. So make sure you got the correct amount here. Now you could go through and put your decimal at the end because that's where you left it. You could go through and make all of your commas. I'm not going to ask you to do that. As long as you have the right number of zeros here, I'm going to be happy. Let's try out my second example here. This time, I still have 5.7 as that first number, but you'll notice that that exponent is a negative 8 this time. So since I know I'm going to be moving left, I'm going to put that 5.7 way over here so I have enough space for all my hops. Again, it's going to be 8 hops, but this time I'm going backwards because negative numbers are to the left. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Once I've drawn 8 hops, I'm going to go through, fill in all of my zeros, and I've got my answer. But I have to rewrite it without my work getting in the way, so I'm going to make sure that I know exactly what my final answer here is. So I'm going to put my decimal first, and that's very, very important. Do not forget the decimal. Then I've got all those zeros. So I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, only 7. So not 8 zeros. You can't just count your zeros with the exponent. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then I had the 5 and the 7. And you need to make sure that you have that decimal there because that makes it a decimal, a very, very small number, and not just a 57 with a whole bunch of zeros in the front. All right, now let's talk about moving backwards. This is where that graphic organizer is going to come in handy. So again, that box only holds one number. All the rest of the numbers have to go after that decimal point. And then that power is going to tell you your hops. So each time here, I'm going to be using that graphic organizer to fill this in. So first step, we need to find the decimal. And if you do not see the decimal, it's going to be all the way at the right-hand side of that number. So if you look at this first example, my 18,500,000, I don't see a decimal there. So that means that I know that it needs to be right here at the end. Right there. Once you have located where your decimal is, we have to move the decimal until only one number is before it. So remember, only one number is going to fit in that box. So I've got to figure out what number gets to go in the box. One way that I like to do this, let's see if there we go, is I like to read across my number, watch my highlighter circle. I read across my number and I stop at the first number that's not 0. Well, that didn't take long. That first number that was not 0 is a 1. So I know that that number is going to go in the box. That also means that my decimal is going to go after the 1, and all the other numbers need to go on the blank. So in this case, it's going to be an 8 and then a 5. Now, I don't need to put all those zeros that are at the end on my blank. As long as I've got the 8 and the 5, I know I'm good. Now I'm going to go ahead. Now I know that it's between the 1 and the 8. So I'm going to count out my hops here. I know it started way over here. So I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hops. So I put a 7 in that exponent. Now remember, positive exponents are big numbers. Oop. There we go. Negative exponents are little numbers. So because this was a really big number, 18 million is a huge number, I'm going to use a positive exponent. So now I'm going to rewrite my final answer without all those zeros and all my graphic organizer. I know that that equals 1.85 times 10 to the 7th power. Let's try another example. I'm going to start out with that graphic organizer. This is always what I do. This shows me your work and that you know what you're doing. Now I need to find that decimal. The decimal in this case, I found it right away. They put it in that number. Now I've got to figure out what number is going to go in that box. Remember, only one number is going to fit in the box. So I've got to figure out exactly which number I'm going to use. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and read my number. And I'm looking for what's the first number that I read that's not 0. So this first number here, this is 0. I can't use that one. I've got to keep going. 0, 0, got to keep going. The first number that I read is that 1. So the 1 is going to go in the box, and everything else is going to go after that decimal. So I'm going to put an 8 and a 5 on that blank. And now I've got to count my hops that it would take to get me there. So I started the first one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hops got me there. But in this case, this was a very, very small number. This is going to have a negative exponent because that was a really, really tiny decimal. If you see 0.00, that's a hint that it's a negative exponent. So let's rewrite our answer here. I have 1.85 first, and then 10 to the negative 7th power. Don't forget that negative. That's very, very important. All right, so real quick review here. Big numbers are going to have positive exponents when written in scientific notation. Small numbers are going to have negative exponents. We just talked about that in the last example. Now I'm going to give you guys a really, really handy cheat sheet here. When they ask you to put numbers in order, all right, so you do not want to have to draw all of your hops and put all of these in order. We want to use our cheat sheet here. So remember, ascending is going from least to greatest, moving up. Descending is going down from biggest to smallest. So my first example, well, my only example for this, says to put the following in ascending order. So as I'm looking, I'm going to start out with the smallest number, and I'm going to end with the biggest number. Now, step 1 says that I need to look at the exponent first, right here. So I'm looking at all my exponents. I have an 8, I have an 8, a 2, and a 5, and I want to put them in order from least to greatest. Well, my smallest exponent is that 2, so I'm going to use that one first. 5.496 times 10 to the second power. And once you use it, you want to cross it off. Now I'm going to look back at those exponents. I have that 8, and that 5. Well, 5 is less than 8, so I'm going to use that one next. This one's going to be an 8.4 times 10 to the 5th power. Use it, cross it off. Now I'm kind of in a little bit of a problem because they're both 8s, so I can't put them in order using the exponent. So I need to go on to step number 2. Now I'm going to look at that number that's getting multiplied. So I have, I'm going to highlight these. I have 1.25 and I have 3.28. So they both have that power of 8. I'm moving on to the numbers 1.25 and 3.28. Well, I know that 1.25 is less than 3.28, so I'm going to use that one next. Use it, cross it off, and that leaves that 3.28 last. So always look at those exponents first, then the number. It'll save you a whole lot of time on that test and assignment. All right, powers of 10. You do get to use a calculator for this. So I have a picture of the calculator that we use in class. I'm going to be showing you some of the buttons that we're going to use, but we're going to have lots of time to practice with this. So real quick review here. You guys can read this on your own, but I do want to point out that the base is that big number. So whenever I talk about the base, I'm talking about the 10 here because we're talking about powers of 10. And the exponent is that little number, that 3, that tells us that we're multiplying 10 by itself 3 times. So negative exponents. This is what's kind of new for 7th grade. They work the exact same way as the positive exponents that we're used to, but that power is going to put the 10 in the denominator of the fraction. So if this is a small line, try to make it fit. So if you have a negative exponent, that's going to make it into a fraction. Put it in the bottom of the fraction. So for example, 10 to the negative 3rd power is the same as 1 over 10 to the 3rd power. We still keep the 10, we still keep the 3, but it just moves into the denominator. Now when you're trying to figure out your decimal, the best way to do this is to use your calculator. So I gave you a whole bunch of calculator tips here. First step, you are going to type in a 10. You do this exactly the same way as how you normally type in a 10. The new thing that you need is that y to the x button. So I've got my little dot over the y to the x button on our calculator. And then you're going to type in the exponent. The thing that you need to remember is that if you have a negative exponent, that negative goes in the calculator after the number that's attached to it. So here you would type in 3 first and then the negative. Let's go ahead and try that out with the calculator. So type in 10 first, then the y to the x button, 3, and then the negative button. Remember the negative, that's going to be right down here underneath the 3 and next to the equal sign. That's our negative positive button. Go ahead and hit equals, and that's going to give us our decimal, our standard form for this power of 10. So 0.001. So we're going to go through using our calculator using this. I have my same steps. Remember the negatives go in after the number. That's the same as what you have on your page. So let's start out with 10 to the 5th power. If I have 10 to the 5th power, that's the same thing as 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. 10 multiplied by itself 5 times. Let's try typing that into the calculator. You're going to type in 10 with me, then the y to the x button, then the 5, hit equals. You are going to get a 1, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 zeros there. So 10 to the 5th power is the same thing as 100,000. Now let's try out 10 to the 4th power. This is the same thing as 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. When we type that into the calculator, 10, and then that y to the x button, and then 4 equals, you're going to get 10,000 as your answer. Now let's try 10 to the third. That's going to be 10 times 10 times 10, which is the same thing as 1,000 when you type it into the calculator. Now I'm going to pause the video, and I want you guys to try out 10 squared and 10 to the first power, and then we're going to compare our answers once you've tried it with the calculator. All right, go ahead and compare your answers to mine. Now the next one that we're going to go ahead and see is 10 to the 0 power. And this is a little bit tricky. This is something that you just have to remember. 10 to the 0 power is 1. Anything to the 0 power is going to give you an answer of 1. So that's just kind of something you have to memorize. If you ever forget, you can use your calculator, so you can try it out. 10 y to the x 0 equals, and you're going to get 1 as your answer. Now I'm going to move my screen down so we can see the rest of my chart. All right, so underneath 0, we are going to fill in 10 to the negative first power. Now this is where it gets a little bit tricky because we have those negatives. Remember, the negative puts it in the denominator of the fraction. So that's the same thing as 1 over 10 to the first power, which is the same thing as just 1 over 10. There's nothing getting multiplied, it's just 1/10. When we type this in, we're going to put 10 y to the x 1 negative equals 0.1. Remember, we're using this y to the x and our negative button here on our calculator. Now let's try out 10 to the negative second. That's the same thing as putting that in the denominator. Anytime you see a negative exponent, it puts it in the denominator of the fraction. It's still 10 to the second, but it's underneath. That's the same thing as 1/10 times 1/10. And when we put that into our calculator, we're going to get 0.01. So you can't just count zeros when it gets to these negative exponents. You have to actually multiply it out and use your calculator. So I'm going to pause the video, and I want you to try out 10 to the negative third, 10 to the negative fourth, and 10 to the negative fifth. I want you to show all your work just like I've been doing, and we'll compare after this. All right, so as you're looking at mine, make sure that you compare all of this. That negative exponent puts it into the denominator of the fraction. And one last thing that I do want to cover here, when we see that negative exponent, and we know that that puts it into the denominator of the fraction, sometimes they're going to do that multiplication piece. So in this middle column, you see, for example, I'll highlight it. I have 1/10 times 1/10. Well, if you multiply that out, you get an answer. You can put 1 over 100, and that's the same thing as 10 to the negative second. So I want you to go back through and just kind of do that multiplication step. 10 to the negative first power doesn't have any multiplication. But when we get to the third power, 10 to the third power was 1,000, so that's what goes in the bottom of the fraction. Those are all the same piece here. So make sure that you add that in there so that you have it. Sometimes they're going to ask you for that.